Hi team, you should have just filled out your fraction names for those four models. Now we're going to look at some improper fractions. We worked on these a lot, but I've been noticing that some of us are forgetting how to name our denominator when we're looking at improper fractions. Remember, the rule for finding your denominator never changes. When you name a denominator or the bottom number, you are naming how many parts are in one whole. How many parts are in the or one whole. So when I look at a 2 as a denominator, I already know that whatever the whole was is broken into 2. Whether that was a circle or a square, I know it has 2 parts because the denominator says 2. That tells me that if it was a circle, it had 2 parts. If it was a square, it had 2 parts. No matter what shape it was, it has 2 equal parts. I also know that my numerator is always going to tell me the parts that I have or that I'm looking at. In this case, it's a 4. Which means we actually have more parts than our whole was broken into. When we have an improper fraction, it means that our numerator is larger or bigger than our denominator. So 3/2 is also an improper fraction because the numerator is bigger than the denominator. However, 1/2 is not an improper fraction. That's actually called a proper fraction, because 1 is smaller than 2, and most fractions that we look at that are, or all fractions that we look at that are proper will have a smaller denominator and a smaller numerator and a larger denominator. When we look at improper fractions, we're looking at fractions that have a larger numerator than the denominator, meaning they will have more parts than there are parts in the whole. Okay, let's look at some examples of that. We're going to look at 4/2 right now. So far, I have halves on my page, but I don't have enough for 4/2 in the circle or 4/2 in the square. I want you to think about how you get 4/2, and I want you to focus on these blue squares. As you remember, we broke our blue square into 2 parts, and we got halves. When we break something into 2 parts, that's called halves. It's out of 2. Now you can see I have a whole nother square. I've got another blue square. And you can see how many parts it's been broken into. It's actually the same as my other whole. This whole is also broken into 2 parts. So this part is called 1 out of 2 parts, or 1/2. And this part is called 1 out of 2, or 1/2. Now, this is where some of us have been getting tricked. When I look at a model like this, it would look something like this. 2 squares broken into 2 parts each. And then I could even shade my model and maybe ask you to name the shaded fraction. If I ask you to name the shaded fraction, I want you to think about your numerator first. We know shaded means colored or darkened. So we see that the shaded parts, there are 1, 2, 3 shaded parts. Now, here's where we've been making a mistake. Some of us are going 1, 2, 3, 4 out of 4 parts. But you know that's not a fourth. That's not a fourth. That's not a fourth, and that's not a fourth. We cannot put 4 as our denominator. When we look at a whole, we look at one whole at a time. And this whole is broken into 2 parts. That right there tells me that it's out of 2. Out of 2. Same for my top whole. This is out of 2 parts. Out of 2 parts. We didn't cut it into 4. We have 4 parts in all, but that's because we have 2 halves here and 2 halves here. If we count those up, we've got 1/2, another half, another half, and another half. We have 1/2s, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves. And if we're only focused on the shaded parts, we have 1/2, 2 halves, 3 halves that are shaded. 3 parts out of only 2 parts in each whole. Sometimes naming your unit fraction helps you. Don't forget you can always name your unit fraction by calling every little piece 1 out of how many are in the whole. Now if we have to name the unshaded fraction, it's already labeled for us. The unshaded fraction is only 1/2. because we're only looking at one part out of two parts in the whole. Now let's check out another one. Now we're back to our circle, and we know it was broken into 4 equal parts, making our denominator 4. The denominator tells how many parts are in one whole. Now I see another whole. This whole is also broken into 4 parts. So that means this piece is only 1 out of 4. This one is 1 out of 4, 1 out of 4, and 1 out of 4, or 1/4. Now, if I color 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these fourths, what fraction is colored or shaded? My shaded fraction is now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 out of how many parts are in one whole. Do not get tricked. I'm not looking at 2 whole circles. The denominator names the parts in one whole. So if I look at one whole or one whole, how many parts are in one whole? There are 4 parts. Every single one of these was called a fourth. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, 5/4. There are only 4 parts in the whole. If we want to name the unshaded fraction, we can look at the unshaded parts. I see 1, 2, 3 are not colored blue. That's 3 out of 4 parts in the whole. Noticing the denominator doesn't change because when we're looking at one model, our denominator remains the same. Depending on what we focus on, we can change our numerator. Do your best. The denominator tells the parts in one whole.